Hey guys, welcome to Now That's Debatable. I am your host, Fantastic Facade, and I am joined with my trusty co-host, AAA the Humanist. And today we have Wes back with us again. He's been one of our more consistent and welcomed guests to have on the show. Today we're going to be talking about reparations and trying to take on a little bit of a different discussion that we just kind of getting out of the realm of religious topics with Wes on this one, just to get everybody in a different mindset a little bit. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and kick things off. How's everybody doing?
Chilling, man. Ready to get started.
All right.
Yeah, man. Good to be
Yep.
back. Thanks for having me.
So, I'm sure there's been lots of. Welcome back, Wes, by the way. I'm sure there's been discussion outside of this talk that we had just before we kicked off live, but is there anywhere particular that either of you would like to start on the discussion of reparations? And I'm
Well,
assuming there's some backstory here that
yeah.
maybe
Usually, I
the
like.
crowd would like
Yeah,
to
usually
know.
I give the guest like first word, but like I'm taking the affirmative position, so I think it just makes more sense for me to go first. All right, because
Sure.
I'm saying like that reparations ought to be paid, and in particular, like, we're talking about reparations, United States to African Americans for slavery and some other things, and so the way I look at it, I look at I'm pretty familiar with um I guess American tort law. I'm not a lawyer or anything, but it's something that I had to study like pretty extensively just in college. And if you just apply principles that we already accept for any other time that the government does something wrong to
I guess American
reparations,
tort.
then reparations ought to be paid. So I have I have this is a semi true story. I have a friend, I will call him Frank. Frank was headed to work one day. He's in Fairfax County, Virginia, and he pulls up. He's in traffic. He's at a red light, and the as soon as the light turns green, there's sirens going off behind him because there's a fire truck, and it's trying to get past people. So in a DC area, it's really congested. There's like way too many people living in this small area, and so a lot of times there's not a lot of room for emergency vehicles to get off. And so he leans to the side a little bit. He swerves off the road a little bit, and the fire truck is coming through. Managed to side swipe his vehicle, and it doesn't hit him. It doesn't hit the vehicle very hard, but it's a fire truck, which is huge. And this fire truck managed to total his vehicle, even though it hit it maybe going like 20, 25 miles an hour. And so the government owed him reparations for his car. That's it. So you break something, you destroy something, you cause somebody harm, you just pay it. That's the way it works. And it's not exactly analogous to slavery because obviously the slaves died off. They're not alive now, but the children are. So in this case, let's take let's take this true story. Let's go a little further with it. Let's add to it. Let's say that while Frank is taking the county of Fairfax to court to get money for his car back, let's say Frank dies. He dies for reasons that had nothing to do with the fire truck incident. The money just goes to his children, the next of kin. It's just principles that we already accept. That's why I say just pay the reparations.
Yep, fair enough. That's a decent principle to come at it, and I think in principle, I'm not opposed to reparations for the reasons that you gave. Right, if there's harm done by one party to another, general legal jurisprudence, basic ideas of justice demand some form of reparation, right? Restitution.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Frank, right, at least repairing his vehicle, maybe some time, some money for his time and lost wages, something like that. That that's not a problem. One of the issues we run into when it comes specifically to this area, though, because like foundationally,
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you on reparations. Where it applies in this case, we're not talking about Frank's kids, right? For one, we're talking about Frank's great grandchildren,
Mhm.
right? Because slavery as a whole
Yeah.
outlawed with, I think it was the 13th Amendment,
Mhm.
and that was ratified not right after the Civil War, but
1865.
yeah, it was. I was thinking a little bit later, but okay, so we'll say mid late
Yeah, but
1800s.
whether his children, grandchildren, doesn't matter. It's next of kin, whoever they are.
Sure. Yeah, I'm willing to grant that in principle, but at
Mhm.
the same time, from a federal level, right? Um, one, that practice was stopped. Two, there were steps taken already to make those reparations initially. Now, granted, we can talk about how flawed those were, how
Mhm.
insufficient they may have been. I'm cool with that. And if that's the case, let's play it out in the courts, right? So to your point, Brake's great grandchildren, great great grandchildren, make the case, see what happens, and if finds a jury willing to do that, or a federal judge willing to rule in their favor, okay. But if we're talking broad swaths, I think what we wind up doing, because of how the government is structured now, is effectively what happens. And so I'm going to use broad categories here.
Mhm.
You're taking money from an entity that was not themselves guilty and giving it to individuals who were not themselves victims. And
So,
and I want to say, to your point though, I
okay.
get if we're talking one generation, maybe two, but we're talking out of living memory of anybody who actually experienced it. And so, if nothing else, I think we can agree that there's a gray area in there somewhere. And so it's not as cut and dry as, yes, there's reparations.
So
Yeah,
you're saying like take money from people who taking money from individuals who wasn't guilty. So all
right.
right. So to be clear, we're not. There's no citizen that we're punishing here. We're punishing the United States, right? The
Well, where
United
does the United
States
States get their money?
from taxpayers, and that's the way it works 100% of the time.
Sure.
So unless we're going to say we don't want to burden taxpayers, so whenever the government does something wrong, we're just going to move on, then we need to apply the same principles, right? Because like I'm just saying, it seems like with reparations, it seems that you want to apply different rules. I'm just
No,
saying
not different
this is
rules.
what we do. So okay, so whether the people who actually own slaves are alive or not, it's irrelevant. We're just talking about the United States who empowered people to own other people.
Sure.
The
So,
United States is responsible.
well, and so we can go another direction there. So another level of the reparations conversation is there have been explicit policies put in place to systemically advantage what we might call the descendants of slaves. Right. Ever since the Civil Rights Act of the
Mhm.
60s, there have been government programs that have focused on Black communities. And those, I mean, whether it's welfare programs, housing programs, job programs, that there have been that are available to them at the exclusion of other segments of the population, right? So if we want to talk
Well,
about the
no,
systemic advantages,
not really. So so those advantages apply to minorities, not black people. Black people really, when we talk about what was it called, affirmative action, black
mm,
people largely really didn't benefit from it. Like who mostly benefited from it was white women, actually.
mm,
But yeah, I mean, you just looked up. This is just a fact. But
it depends on what we're talking about. So I'd
like
be interested to see some specifics.
yeah, mostly when we're talking about applying for jobs and whatnot. But in like any sort of like government program trying to advance black people, that's not really what I'm talking about. Race has literally nothing to do with it. We're talking about people who were victims of the United States policy,
Mhm.
whether they're black or not. We're just talking about just people who they were. Like, so race really doesn't matter. We're talking about, were you a descendant of someone who was a slave in the United States? Also, to sidestep, I want to talk about Phantom Max. He made a comment. He said, one problem with the analogy is that the government didn't directly participate in slavery. It just didn't outlaw it. And he said,
Fair point.
so to address that, I don't think that's necessarily relevant. So yes, the United States didn't own a slave, because that's I guess not. That's not necessarily what governments did. Although slaves did build the Capitol, so did and in other federal buildings. But if the government derelicts its duty to protect its constituents, and in this sense, having a law that allows people to be enslaved, then yes, reparations are still owed. Just like for instance, like with Jewish people, like with the Holocaust. Say that if the government didn't actually sponsor a genocide, but it said something like the murder of Jewish people is now legal, reparations still ought to be paid, even though the government didn't directly kill anyone. It derelicted its duty, its responsibility to protect its constituents. And we see this applied in tort law all the time. Like there's a case in Virginia where a tree grew in front of a stop sign, and so it was completely obstructed. Somebody ran through it and was killed. Right? The government didn't do anything; it just derelicted its duty. So that's why it still applies here.
So when you say the government was derelict in their duty in that situation with the stop sign, what government are we talking about, and what should they have done?
Well, that was Virginia. Well, they should have cut down a tree.
So the state should have cut down a tree that was obstructing a stop sign.
Yeah, because it was a state's highway, state stop sign, and a tree grew right in front of it, and like it took a long time. We're talking about a tree, right? Mm-hmm. Like this wasn't bamboo that can grow really fast. This was some kind of tree. But so the point I was trying to make, whether it actively does something to you or just derelicts your duty, it still owes reparations to you. Like for instance, like if I'm your lifeguard, mm-hmm. and I don't drown you, but while you're swimming, I'm just on my phone, not paying attention,
and you don't take action to save.
Yes, I now have some sort of responsibility to you. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from in that, and in my view, I would be more apt to give credence to it if there were more solid plans. For example, like a reparation plan. Like, what's it going to take? Is it going to be a one-time payment? Is this ongoing money for an extended period of time? Is it not mm-hmm. money? Is it something else? Is it something, say, like land or specific educational opportunities, right? So that's on one level. But then part of what makes this such a muddy issue, mm-hmm. and maybe we could talk about this a little bit, is the blending of, shall we say, the gene pool, right? Because you, to your credit, you say doesn't have anything to do with race. We're not talking about skin color. We're talking about ancestry. Mm-hmm. All right. So what if the three of us all take those, 33andMe or Ancestry.com test, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, AAA, you're 60% descendant from American slaves, and Facade and I are somewhere between like 10 and 15%. Mm-hmm. Are we going to get some of this benefit too? Are you going to get less than somebody, say, who was 70, 80%? Right. So it's not just to us. Is it based off a percentage of your descendants, or is it just everybody who's a descendant automatically gets whatever this benefit is?
Well, I mean,
that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I mean,
I know I threw a lot out there, so we can untangle these knots as we go.
Yeah, I mean, so fortunately, this wasn't that long ago. So mm-hmm. you're talking about like 2, 3, 4, like max 5 generations ago. So it wouldn't be that diluted. But where'd you draw the line? Like, at what percentage would you draw the line? I mean, somewhere. Like, what if you only have one person? You only have one descendant who was a slave. I mean, draw the line somewhere. I mean, I got a mixture of things. I mean, I look mostly black. If you were to see like my mom's sisters, right? Like you could see there's like this Korean, and it's very evident in them. I also have some Native American, and I have pretty significant percentage of white in me as well. Mm-hmm. But I mean, and so not all of my descendants were slaves, but so where would you draw the line? Somewhere.
Okay.
Somewhere.
So,
like, I mean,
point of correction.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think you're talking about just from the moment slavery ended, but
Mhm.
slavery existed as an institution in the colonies
For a long
well
time.
before that. And even if we just go to the beginning of America, we're still talking about a century
That's,
before that.
you would
Probably
you would
3
start
additional generations.
you start at America, and so you would start at America, and prior to that, you would have to go to the British, and also it wouldn't just be the United States. Like I can tell you the like the particular who the slave owner was for like one of my families. They were down in South Carolina. Matter of fact, it was a guy named Colonel Kit. He was an officer in the Confederate Army. And
Did he actually own slaves, or did he just serve for the Confederates?
he owned slaves, and then he slept with one of them. Hence, I'm here. That's how we got here. So not only would I be able to like for me in particular, reparations from the United States,
Mhm.
and for me reparations from South Carolina, since I can show that. For somebody else, it might be reparations from Mississippi or Alabama or somewhere else. So all the parties that are involved, you're getting. We're not getting any individual since the slave owners are no longer alive.
Okay, but so when we come back to like this idea of jurisprudence of going from the perpetrator to the victim, so you would want the proceeds, for example, to go to the descendants of the victims.
Mhm.
Would that not also make sense that it would come from the estate of the perpetrator, right? So in essence, the
If
descendants of the
Yeah,
perpetrators. So like this uh, specific Confederate general has other descendants, right? So you
we know who they
plot
are
that,
too.
yeah, plot
My
that
aunt has
family tree out.
met some of them. Yeah, they're living in Arlington, Virginia. Pretty
Uh,
hardcore liberal family, staunch Democrats. But
Right. So the part of the family that doesn't dovetail off with your particular slave ancestor, right?
Mhm.
Plot that out. Now to make it fair and equitable, right? Then it would be the government saying that the estate belonging to this family collectively would owe the estate of this particular ancestor X amount of reparations, right? So it's
Yeah,
not
so
necessarily
it would
it's not Uncle Sam, right? It
it'd
sounds
be
like you're
both.
saying also states, right?
Yeah.
So South
So
Carolina,
states, it'd be United States, South Carolina, and if you could go to the estate of the family that owned it, I would be okay with that as long as we only got the. So, for instance, let me explain. Let's say you owned me, and I came to you for reparations, right? And
mhm,
then you died. All right, I could seize your estate. I could
get a
seize your
lien on it.
money. Yes, I couldn't go after your children's money unless what I could only go after the part that they inherited from you
Right.
because it's still yours. But I couldn't go after their descendants. Like your children are not responsible for what you did.
Yeah. So if
You
I
are.
had like a mutual funds that they inherited, that's an
Yeah.
inherited like IRA or what have you. You could
Yes.
have a portion of that
Yes.
justifiably.
Yes. And so we're talking about like families from slaves. I don't think. I mean, I doubt if any there would be very few families that still have that money left in them. Matter of fact, after the Civil War, it became like impoverished. Like a lot of that
Mhm.
money just no longer exists. That's why I think it's unrealistic to try to go after these estates. The money's just
Mhm.
no longer there, but the state's money is still there, and the United States money is still there.
So that's
They're
an
guilty.
interesting angle when we're talking about jurisprudence, right? If say to take your example that I owned you,
Mhm.
but for whatever reason I went bankrupt, right? Your claim to reparations would end with that bankruptcy, right? Because that's part of being bankrupt is everybody you owe money to. Sorry, there's nothing left.
Well, yeah, for you, for like for you. But
Right.
if there was a larger government that also allowed you to do that, I could still go after them.
Okay, and so that's where um, I would say, if that's the case you want to make, take it up in court, right? Find a lawyer who wants to take the case, file it in the appropriate jurisdiction, and go. Let the chips fall where they may, right?
Well, I mean, I mean, the argument that I made, would you not be in support of it? Wouldn't you say this is the right thing to do?
I would not.
Why not?
I don't think I would, because for one, I think whoever it was in the chat that you brought up rightly points out that the culpability of the government is limited because they're not the ones who inflicted it. But
that doesn't matter.
It's not that
you
it
don't have to
doesn't
inflict
matter.
something. You can also derelict your duty. Like, for instance, like we're talking about with the like New Orleans, the levees. They didn't do anything. They just derelicted the duty, and it caused widespread flooding, thousands dead, trillions lost. You don't have to do something. You could also just be irresponsible and
Sure.
and not uphold your obligation to your constituents.
Right. I don't say that to absolve, for example, state governments of potential liability. I say that to distinguish between liabilities, right? So the state is not primarily liable for the actions of individuals that reside within that state, for example, right? So Uncle Sam is not liable for, let's say, Uncle Sam's not liable for the crimes that serial killers commit, for example. However, there may be some liability that rests upon them for, like you say, neglect or dereliction of duty.
So in this case, so Uncle Sam wouldn't be liable for what serial killers did, unless you can point to the fact that the serial killer did what he did because Uncle Sam told him he could.
Right.
Which is exactly analogous to slavery.
Yeah. So I think a more appropriate comparison in this type of situation would be like COVID, right? When you have government entities prohibiting people from being able to go work, prohibiting people from being able to open their businesses. So there is specific financial harm inflicted on individuals. And so the money that was paid out in COVID money, what have you, which, side note, my libertarian leanings would say that the government sucks at everything, including compensating people for all of this mess that happened. Money that was given in those situations is more along the lines of reparations in that sphere, because they actually, the government, federal and states, very often prohibited this and inflicted that financial harm. Therefore, some sort of financial compensation was just. I don't think you have the same type of comparison for slavery, because, as I said before, I think time muddies the issue. You have a difficult.
But why would time matter? Because like our current precedent, the way we do it, it's just the next of kin, whoever that is, and the offending party, the defending party is still here, the United States. You just pay the next of kin, whoever that may be.
So then the question becomes, what is the liability of the United States? What liability justifiably falls on them? And I have
are you asking like how much they should pay, or?
Well, I mean, I put that out there earlier. That's one of the knots that I have yet to see sufficiently untangled. Are we talking about just money? Is it cash payouts?
Well, I mean, so most of the time when the government has to do any sort of reparations, it's just financial, right? So like a lot of times, like in the case with my friend, fake name Frank, like they reimbursed him with money. Like they didn't buy him a new car; they just reimbursed him. So and that's what I suggest. It could come in other ways. You can come and, like, just say, hey, like, no taxes. That just don't pay any taxes at all. That'd be great. I would enjoy that. So I mean, but it doesn't. I don't. I mean, at the end of the day, the method does matter, but it's not relevant to the question of whether it ought to be paid. Like, what if I took my reparations money and just have fun at the strip club?
Yeah, or take it to the casino, put it all on. Put it all on black.
Yeah, right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, but I could do that. It wouldn't matter. The government still
Yep.
needs to pay what it owes. Like they don't like we don't consider how financially responsible the recipient is. If you wreck something, you destroy somebody's stuff, you cause somebody harm, you pay the money. Period.
Yeah, and I think that's where the time and the say not necessarily the number of descendants, but the number of generations. That's what I'm looking for. So the amount of time, the number of generations, muddies the issue because for somebody who is, shall we say, underprivileged
Mhm.
today, for this jurisprudence to connect. Did I just do the thumbs? Okay.
Yeah, I was about to say, what was that?
I think it's something that Google or Apple or whatever,
Okay.
I'm on a Mac. But sorry, I got sidetracked.
Right.
In order to justifiably say the government has liability there, you would have to say that underprivilegedness is caused to some degree by the offending party, which would be the United States.
No.
I,
So
I,
like
I
again,
think so.
so again, so like let's say fire truck hits Frank. Frank dies before he collects his money. Frank's children do not have to prove that they're in some sort of economic calamity due to the fire truck hitting them. They owe the money. Just pay it. Like I don't consider myself an underprivileged person. Like
Right.
I have a good job. I make really good. I pay more in taxes than what most people make. I'm not a underprivileged person at all. I've done very well for myself, but I would still be owed the money. It doesn't matter if I need it. It doesn't matter if I'm underprivileged as a result of it. There were real people who suffered great harm because of laws of the United States. So
Right.
that
But if we're
money
going to
needs to be
pay
paid.
out, sorry.
Yeah, that was the end of my sentence.
Okay. Sorry. I'm intentionally trying not to interrupt. So I appreciate that.
Mhm.
So if in your situation though, for example, Frank's kids, there's defined definite harm that was done to Frank that is now going to be paid to the kids, regardless of any situation. So then the question becomes, what defined definite harm was done to the individual, specifically with liability falling on the United States government? And so I'll say, let's just say for the sake of argument, let's grant that. I don't know that. I mean, I'm still not there for the purposes of modern day, like I would in Reconstruction, right? If the United States government came out and said, "Look, we just fought a war over this. This was wrong. This was awful. Here's a check. Here's 40 acres and a mule. Here's whatever it took to satisfy reparations at that point." That would have been that would have been sufficiently just. Now, I don't know, and that's why I'm on
But
the no
I
side.
just don't see.
So
I don't see I don't see the where the breakage happens. Like we know it's the next of kin, and we're talking about, like Jesse had made a point in chat that I like to say. So like you were talking about like this I guess the ambiguity of being able to define who and where you were on and all that kind of stuff. Like in my case, I know exactly like where my family was enslaved. Like I can tell you the name of the family, I can tell you what they did, and I can tell you where their legitimate children live now. Like my aunt met them on one occasion. And so like why shouldn't I get my reparations? Why shouldn't the people, we may not be able to find everybody, but we can find some of them. So we can't fix all the wrongs, but we can fix some of them. Why not just fix the ones you can?
just gonna let that sit, think on that for a sec, because it's a good question. And so let's talk about it in
Also,
terms
let's,
of statute of limitations. Right, at a certain point, we recognize in the judicial system there are certain crimes that after a certain amount of time just cannot be adjudicated.
Yeah,
Right?
that applies to criminal law.
Recognize that. Yeah,
Not civil law, not tort law. What I'm talking about. There's
I,
no statute of limitations on it.
well, depending on the severity of financial law, it can rise to the level of criminality. It's not
Well,
necessarily a
sure,
civil
but
case.
yeah, but in this case, I'm talking specifically about a civil case, because what the United States did was legal. So I don't think you can make the argument that it was a crime.
Mm-hmm.
They owe damages, but what they did was within the parameters of the law.
Yeah. So okay, I think probably where some of the disconnect is that the way that I understand how it would work practically is like if you wanted reparations, right?
Mm-hmm.
You would need to show that you were done harm that stems from this. No, because effectively, like Frank's kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
They received harm because of what happened to Frank, right?
Well,
For whatever the situation is.
So, but yes, but
Because
they're not.
that's where it stems from, right?
Yeah, but they're not trying to right any wrong done to Frank's kids. They're righting the wrong done to Frank, but Frank's is dead. So now the only way to do it is vicariously through the children. It's just going to the next of kin.
Right, but
United States
in that,
the United States wouldn't be making any. They're not paying for their wrongs committed to me. It would be to the people who were actually slaves.
yeah, I think we're kind of talking in circles around here around this, because I think if that were to work, there would have to be some sort of plan. So maybe it just comes down to practicality.
Sure, but
and I know there's the principle of it, right? Is this something that, and I guess I would lean on to provide more clarity in this discussion. I would say that reparations institutionally paid by the federal government and by individual states would have made much more sense in the immediate generations following the abolition of slavery. Once that determination was made, then it would have made all the sense in the world to follow that up with whether it's one-time pay, whether it was non-financial benefits like land grants and things like that, whether it was generational. Hey, the former slave gets X amount of money, slave's offspring gets a fraction of that for a generation or two or three. That makes sense. At this point, it's maybe it's better said, I'm agnostic on the issue now because I haven't seen any plan put forth that makes sense in a just way. So
I don't see why it would be unjust though, because like I'm not seeing. You're saying it would make more sense to do it back then. Yes, but they didn't. So now we can do it now. Like it doesn't make any less sense to try to fix it now. But that's just what happened. So you just apply to the next of kin. I'm just applying the same principles in tort law and civil law that we apply today. If you're saying that we should suspend the payments because it was such a long time ago, that's a deviation from the principles that we apply in civil law now.
Well, because
these are different rules.
There's a sense in which the scale takes this out of the bounds of what would be normal jurisprudence for civil financial matters. I think fundamentally that's where the flaw in the reasoning is to say, well, it just goes from generation to generation. It's not that simple, right? In the situation of Frank's kids, sure, but if Frank was a great grandparent and whatever the situation was, whether there were appeals and what have you, and we're talking about 5 generations of his family go. Now you could make the argument because there was a live case while Frank was alive. Okay, there's descendants once that case is adjudicated.
Those are different. But so now you're applying different rules.
Well, I'm not applying different rules because there's not a clean way to.
So, but so let's say Frank died and never never actually pursued money from Fairfax County.
Right.
If his children could show that a fire truck swiped this car and totaled it, Fairfax County will still have to pay that. And just because Frank is dead and Frank never actually seek reparations for it, it wouldn't matter. It's just the same rules. if you're going to apply different rules, I need to
Now,
see why, and I'm not getting that.
yeah, it's not different because and it just occurred to me, if we're talking about civil, then we're not talking about the crime of enslavement, because that's not going to be something that's merely civil.
Well, it's
And so
this,
that's
the
categorically
enslavement.
that's where my mind was.
So enslavement wasn't a crime. Remember, that was legal. So like the United States is not going to be held guilty when somebody is committing a crime. Like if I were to go in and hit you in the head with a bat, the United States isn't guilty of anything. Well, I broke the law, and so now they're going to prosecute me, throw me in jail, and all that kind of stuff. But if they say it's legal to hit Wes in the head with the bat, and then I do it as a result of that, that's a different case entirely.
Sure.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and so with that being the case, the act in question is not merely a civil act, right? We're talking about a felony, right? We're talking about assault and battery.
Well, yeah,
in that situation. And so in the case of slavery, we're talking about
in your case,
at worst.
Well, in the analogy that I gave, it wouldn't be assault and battery because it'd be legal. It'd. I remember I said in the analogy, the government says you can do it.
Yeah, but retroactively, right? Once the government comes back and goes, actually, no, that's assault and battery, then that the idea behind what you're saying is that retroactively makes that a crime, and therefore
I wouldn't say that. Like retroactive laws, like those are illegal. You can't outlaw a past act. What is it called? A post facto law? It's in the Constitution.
Yeah. Okay.
I wouldn't be in support of that.
So if that's the case, then
somebody of a
the
crime
whole idea of slavery. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Prasad.
I was just going to point out that you can't convict somebody of a crime that wasn't illegal at the time the crime was committed.
That's what I was saying. Like, I think it's called a post facto law. It's in the Constitution.
When they outlawed like certain drugs, people that had done drugs previously couldn't be arrested for doing drugs in the past because they weren't illegal at the time they were done.
Yeah, so if we're talking about that type of legal process, then you could say that slavery was legal. Therefore, there was no undue harm done. So any concept of reparations isn't a matter of justice anyway, because according to the laws.
I'm not talking about crime. We're talking about civil law, because what they did was legal. Like for instance, like it would be like, and like,
by the way, like just to really clarify here, just like in the example we gave of the fake Frank, right? Like we don't know Frank's real name, but like in the situation of Frank, the emergency service vehicles have the right to travel in the emergency lane. It is legal for them to do so. It's legal for them to drive their car faster than the legal speed limit in instances and cases of emergency, right? Now, in Frank's case specific, we mentioned that they were going slow, but it still totaled his car. But they were doing something completely legal. They were traveling in the breakdown and or emergency lane to get to their destination. Just like at the time, slavery was completely legal. That doesn't mean that harm wasn't caused. That just means that the harm that was caused was done in a legal manner. And that's the distinction that AAA has been trying to point out, is that at the time slavery was legal, but there's still obvious harm that comes from the owning of other people. Whether we can go down the rabbit hole of how poorly that slaves were treated, or we go further down the rabbit hole of saying, because of slavery it put blacks at a strict disadvantage for things like education and welfare and healthcare and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then all the laws that spawned thereafter, including like Jim Crow and even things like in modernity like redlining, where it's just like it spawns from people being treated as property. And so it's really obvious that there was harm done. It's obvious that harm still occurs because of the harm done. And so, like, we have a definitive, like, there was harm done. We have a way, not for everyone, but a way for people to trace this harm back to a time where these actions were legal. At least some of the actions, the owning of slaves. Perhaps not the beating and raping and murdering, but, the slavery itself was legal. But and just like kind of in the case of Frank, what I wanted to ask is like, would you consider it any different if Frank was like a great grandfather and the his children and grandchildren and like his grandchildren and his great grandchildren were all dead, but the only person alive is still like a 1 year old or an infant? And would you still think that it's okay for the Fairfax County to pay the infant for destroying Frank's car, even though, an infant can't drive or own cars, Wouldn't you still say
Sure.
that probably falls in line? The only difference is that you're adding more years and more generations to Frank's story than to the slaves.
Yeah, I don't think there's any issue with that. In the case of reparations, though, it comes back to what's the harm that was done, and what's the necessary remedy, right? And that's the big issue when it comes.
Are you
to
asking what harm was
reparation.
done as from slavery?
Well, no, not what harm was done from slavery, because we've agreed the act of slavery itself
Yeah.
is not on here. We're talking about what harm was done in terms of, say, lost wages, what financial specific harm was done. And to your point that I think you mentioned this earlier, it's kind of a case by case basis. It's not one size fits all,
Yeah,
right?
I mean,
So
it's,
so
but-
we can know who the descendants were, but once we trace that back to particular individuals within the slave trade, so let's use your hypothetical or not hypothetical, no, because it was a specific Confederate general. Was it Confederate general or corporal?
he was a captain, but they called him
Captain.
Colonel Kit.
Okay, so yeah, so all right, so
Colonel
Confederate
was just his
officer.
nickname.
Yeah, so we'll say officer. So that particular individual held a particular slave that was one of your ancestors. So when it comes down to what harm was done to that particular ancestor of yours, how do we adjudicate that?
Oh, I mean, you'd put some financial money on it. I mean, but it wouldn't just be like the last one. By the way, I mean, it's like not only with that the slave who was raped by Colonel Kit, not only her, but her mom and dad and them. I mean, so this
provided they were enslaved.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, and so.
But
yeah,
I mean, if this particular individual was sold into slavery from her family or her tribe on continental Africa, then it's not the rest of the generations.
Yeah. So like,
right. And that was the point I was making too.
Whatever
it's
generation,
not just the end of slavery, but the beginning of America.
Yeah,
so it's all of them.
Yeah, I'll say like whatever generations that were actually enslaved. And I wouldn't stop at slavery either. Like I think we have a dereliction of duty with the black codes, with segregation laws. If you look at the Housing Act, and that definitely led
none of that has to do with reparations of slavery, though. Those are totally different.
Well, I'm not talking about reparations of slavery. I was saying reparations. So like it wouldn't stop there. Like the same rules would apply.
Yeah, once you get into, I'd say as a blanket, once you get into trying to issue reparations for additional government acts that came after that, you're going to have a much more difficult time, because the government has also made steps to eradicate those and make whole for those as well.
That doesn't matter. So
I'm with you on that,
okay.
But let's just come back to, let's start with slavery, for example.
Okay.
What's the financial harm that was done for one particular individual that was enslaved? Because you got to have some kind of rubric to get to a financial number, and then to see how it plays out over the generations.
You should throw some arbitrary number on it. So like for instance, like my great grandmother or whatever generation, she was not only a slave her whole life, but she was also raped as a result, and suffer a lot of abuse. So we put some sort of like financial I don't know. I mean, let's say $1 million, right?
Okay.
So
$1 million for each of that particular slave's descendants.
Yeah, I mean that wouldn't be a very practical way. What I was saying to do was just you could do like no taxes. Like I don't pay any federal income tax, And if I lived in South Carolina, I don't. But if I lived in South Carolina, I wouldn't have to
No
pay
state
estate
taxes.
tax either. Mm-hmm. It seems that to me that seems fair. That could be the form of my reparations, and that would amount to thousands. That would be a lot for me.
I don't think it would affect as many people as you're talking about, because with our tax code, I think it's 49%, somewhere around there, of all working adults, quote
Mhm.
unquote, pay no federal income tax
Yeah, I
because
mean,
of the
well, if
progressive tax system.
so, I mean, it doesn't have to be doesn't have to be blanket. Maybe maybe if you're not paying taxes, it could be reparations in some other form. It's just like, I mean, like, I don't have like a specific plan and saying it's going to pay this exact amount. Like whatever model and whatever figure we plan to give, it is necessarily going to be arbitrary, because that's just the way numbers work. But what I wanted to do was just get us on the same page to agree that reparations for slavery ought to be paid.
I mean, personally, I would say no. Still at this point, because
Could you point to just the whole? Tell me, is there an error in the way that I'm applying the way the law works, generally speaking?
I don't know that there's necessarily an error per se, because for one, I'm
Then
not a
you
legal
ought to
expert.
accept it.
No, not necessarily. Just because I'm ignorant of. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, right?
Okay, all right.
And
So
I'm not involved in civil law, so I recognize, but I know enough about the law to know there's a vast ocean out there of knowledge and precedents that I don't know, right? So, for example, um, I couldn't tell you right now what the longest statute of limitations is when it comes to federal civil law. I know there's probably one.
I don't think
but
there's any statute of limitations on civil law.
I,
From my knowledge, I think that is just criminal law. Facade is looking it up right now. He got this look up face.
Yeah. Okay. Good deal.
But, yeah.
But so for example, that's a category that would be important to this discussion, right?
Well,
So for example, let's just say for example, until we get confirmation from Facade here, if there's financial harm done, the statute of limitations, the longest in federal code is 120 years. Okay, so but if that's the window, that affects this conversation, right? Because if we start here and we go back 120 years, we're at 1900.
Sure. All right, so I'm looking it up right now.
See
so
what I mean?
I was wrong about the statute of limitations, right? So there is
the long and the
for
short
breach of
is
injury.
The average is between 1 and 5 years, depending on what state you're in, for most civil crimes. That is
No, I'm not talking about state level. I'm talking about federal.
Well, from a federal level, it's going to get much harder, just because, like, federal civil laws don't really come up nearly as often, and when they do, they're often, like, where I was going is that the rule states is upon date of discovery, and then you can't just run out the clock by essentially extending this forever in court. So, by like taking someone to court, assuming that the charges or the civil lawsuit was filed before 5 years of discovery, it wouldn't matter how long the court case took. It could go on ad infinitum. Right. But most of the time it's 5 years. I'll look and see if there is a specific thing for federal law, but
okay. So then there comes to the question of what constitutes discovery, right? So Facade, how long have you known about this particular ancestor of yours?
Well, so that's not.
I mean, not Facade.
I mean, I've known about it for a really long time. I mean,
longer than 5 years.
Yeah, and so your argument would be that since the statute of limitations ran out, now it ought not to be paid.
That's not my argument in total. Okay. My categorical argument is there's so much about the law that I'm not aware of because I'm not in that space, that I can't simply say I can't find the error in your reasoning, therefore I should agree
Accept?
with you.
Well, to
No,
me,
yeah,
that is the perfect reason to accept. Like, if you gave an argument and I couldn't punch a hole in it, then I would accept it. That's how
well,
things ought to work.
I would say I can't point to any specifics, but I know there's a vast volume of legal information that I don't know that probably influences this, that probably comes into
Sure.
play, such as, for example, statute of limitations. So if if there was a federal statute of limitations that was longer, I use the example of 120 years, which by comparison to states seems to be drastically overshot. But
Mm-hmm.
even if we were using that, statute of limitations ran out in 1904.
Right. So,
Right. So anything that's
do have a
discovered
distinct
after
answer.
then, when it comes to who
no,
were
no, no,
slaves
no.
or descendants of slaves.
But here's the thing. So it's a little bit unprecedented. So there's very statute of limitations for like personal injury, libel, fraud, property damage,
Sure.
etc. Right? Slavery is not really applied, and I'm not talking about. I shouldn't have to like file like some sort of claim and try to prove my case. So like,
Why not?
well,
and isn't that how this sort of thing works? If you want civil penalties, you've got to show the civil harm.
Well, I mean, sure. I mean,
you don't want an exception, right? You want this to be treated like any other civil case, right?
Sure, but But I thought we were just understanding this is like something that's pretty obvious. Slavery did happen. I wouldn't have to prove that this is a thing that happened, right?
You're right. I'm not saying you got to prove slavery happened.
Okay, so we're acknowledging like this thing happened. So then the reparations ought to be paid
within the category or within
the statute of limitations
process.
Well,
not
don't
just the statute of limitations. Well, I'm not saying they don't exist. We don't know.
If it helps, I do have a specific federal law about civil penalties under acts of Congress. It's under U.S. Title Code 28, Section 1658, entitled Time Limitations on the Commencement of Civil Actions Arising Under the Acts of Congress. Part A, except as otherwise provided by law, a civil action arising under an act of Congress enacted after the date of the enactment of this section may not be commenced later than 4 years after the cause of action accrues.
Okay, so 4 years, basically, is how I heard that.
Does
that sound about right?
To me.
Okay, so 4 years, and how many years are we removed?
Yeah, so is that your argument that since we're outside the statute of limitations, that it ought not to be paid?
It's not the only one, but the statute of limitations is certainly an important consideration when you're talking about civil law and financial remedy.
Because I mean, and the problem I'm seeing here is that if you look at the history that was right afterwards, like surely you realize that like people weren't in a situation to actually bring any lawsuit towards the court.
How do you figure?
Well, they were black in America, where they didn't really have a right to vote. They even after the passage of the 15th Amendment, it was difficult to get that done. I mean,
but my point is, you don't know for sure, right? It's a reasonable inference based on the information we have. But is it a case that you could make in court?
Well, yeah.
I'd
also think so?
Like
because also too, because like this wasn't like we're not talking about an act of Congress. We're talking about something that was allowed in the Constitution. You know what I'm saying? Like an act of Congress versus the a constitutional act.
Well, I mean, an act of Congress would presumably fall under the heading of Constitution because you've got Article 1 of the Constitution that dictates.
That wasn't an act of Congress, though. Yeah, but that wasn't an act of Congress, though.
I mean, if you're going to hold the federal government accountable.
No, Article 1 created Congress. Article 1 is not an act of Congress.
No, I'm not saying Article 1 is an act.
In Article 1, they're allowed to have slaves. So with that, what he talked about was the act of Congress, right? That's what that applied to. It sounds like you're saying Article 1 is an act of Congress. It is
No,
not.
I'm
Article 1
I'm
created
not saying
Congress.
right. I'm saying Article 1 established Congress and its bounds, right?
Yes.
It created limitations, and like this is Congress,
Yes.
right? But acts of Congress fall under that category of this is who Congress is, this is what Congress can do.
Yeah, but
right? Constitutional permission.
Article 1, which is where slavery is first mentioned, right? That is what I've been pointing to.
Okay.
That is not an act of Congress.
Well, agreed. I'm not saying it's an act of Congress. What I would say the act.
Cool. It doesn't apply then. So let's talk about.
What do you mean it doesn't apply?
Well, so because it sounds like you was using. So from the beginning, it sounded like you were trying to find any type of argument you could to go against reparations, and they were failing.
No.
And now we're here on the statute of limitations, and I feel like you think you're onto something, and but you're misapplying it. Because
what am I misapplying?
Well, you're talking about the statute of limitations applying to acts of Congress that Facade had pointed out, and that is not what I've been referring to at all. You
referred to the difference between
the United States
actively
government
doing something and then neglects dereliction of duty.
Yes,
right?
And we're talking about the United States government,
right? Of which Congress is a part, and
Congress is part of.
Where is the monetary policy enacted?
Congress in most cases.
Exactly. So what we're talking about,
it wasn't. To be clear, Congress did not make a law to allow slavery. It's in the Constitution.
Okay.
Okay, so when we're talking about the statute of limitations, it applies to acts of Congress. We're not talking about the Constitution.
But part of your case, right, hinges on the inaction of the federal government.
Yes.
Right. It's not that, for example, Congress actively held slaves, right? But Congress had a fiduciary responsibility to people who resided within the boundaries of the United States that they failed in acting.
The government.
And so if we're talking about the failure of the government, not uniquely Congress, but the act or the law that Facade brought up specifically referred to Congress. Right. So there's at least a tie. And so this is where our mutual ignorance of federal law comes into.
There's a tie, but Article 1 is not an act of Congress, just to be clear.
I don't know how many times I have to agree with you.
But then why are we tying the statute of limitations to Article 1?
We're not tying it to Article 1.
Okay, so let's throw out the statute of limitations because
forget about statute of limitations. Okay. We don't have any precedents. So how would you like to see this addressed? Because at this point, now you're not talking about putting it in the context of our existing laws and precedents. You're talking about special exemption for this particular idea of reparations.
Well, it's not a special exemption, like because there's not like this is usually how it's done, and now we're going to have an exemption. That's not what we're talking about.
That's exactly what we're talking about.
No.
If there's a law that has a tie, what are
the other instances where people were enslaved as a result of the American Constitution?
I don't understand the question.
Okay, you were saying that I'm trying to have an exception to the way reparations are applied.
Right. Do you know why? Can you understand my reasoning and why I would say that?
Yes, I understand your reason. It seems like because you think you're still trying to tie this Article 1 to being some sort of act of Congress, and I was explaining, and I was explaining
explicitly.
But I
hear me clearly.
Yeah, no.
Article 1 is not an act of Congress.
Yes, but
can we agree on that? That I believe Article 1 is not an act of Congress.
And let me finish. And so I pointed out how it's actually part of the Constitution, and you were saying that now it's totally unprecedented. No, it is not. It is not. And so when we look at cases, when we look at precedent, obviously there are going to be things about that case that don't match another case, but you can look
Right.
at principles. You
Mhm.
can look at principles and extrapolate those and apply it when necessary. And so generally, when the government messes up your stuff, they fix the stuff. That's just how things work.
See, now I think you're falling into the error of believing that our legal system makes any sort of logical sense.
Okay, but
There's
so
in a lot of
let's say
instances where it doesn't. So
let's say
I'd
it doesn't
like
make
to
logical
interject
sense.
some
But
fun
go ahead,
where
law.
Josiah.
in Article 1 are we talking about slavery? Let's go there. What's the particular reference, the particular clause, paragraph, section, what have you,
I'd
of
like
Article
to point
1?
out some really
Oh,
interesting
Section
law,
10.
if I could.
Go ahead.
So we may not have good precedents for reparations paid to former slave owners in the 1860s, or to slaves that descended from slave owners in the 1860s. However, we actually do have some pretty interesting cases of reparations paid to other people. For instance, the
Native
descendants
Americans.
the descendants of Japanese Americans
Internment camps.
internment camps, which were paid in 1988 and 1990, which were
Mhm.
more than 50 years removed from World War II.
Yep.
So we are aware that even the 6-year or 5-year or even 4-year, depending on which civil law you look at and what's going on a federal level, because it ranges from 1 to 6 years as a maximum from what I can see. And even then, the one I refer to specifically in Title 28 of the U.S. Code was talking specifically about acts of Congress, not acts of the Constitution or the government itself. We do see there is a precedent set, or there is, if it's not precedence itself, it was found legal to set precedents for reparations paid at least 50 years after the act with Japanese internment camp hostages. So just wanted to kind of point that fun legal statute out that this happened and the laws weren't passed until at least 50 years after the fact.
Yeah, no, and correct me if I'm wrong, though, in that case, Fasad, the individuals that were interned were recognized as U.S. citizens. Is that right?
I can double check that for you, but I mean,
I'm pretty sure that's the
I
case,
will say
and
that slaves,
legally
upon
speaking,
their
that's not an
release
insignificant
became,
distinction between
Well,
uh,
I mean, like,
those
Is-
enslaved.
is your
I'm gonna
go ahead.
sound like an asshole here, but slaves were 3/5 of a citizen. And
Yeah.
and in 1865 they became 5/5 of a citizen. So,
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna say.
But-
This
but-
is like
but not
a
for-
really
not-
bad argument because
No.
now, and
No,
by
no, no.
your argument, the government could do whatever it wants to somebody by just removing their citizenship from them and do whatever they want and
No.
then not be held accountable.
No, because
This is
no,
exactly
that's
where
not
you
what
were
we're
going.
No, that's not it. That's not what I was
Okay.
talking about at all. Because in the
Okay.
instance of slavery, you have individuals that were not considered citizens. The 3/5 compromise was for congressional representation. Slaves weren't voting at this point. They weren't active citizens in that regard. So it's
is
not like
your
they had
argument-
citizenships.
To be clear, is your argument against reparation is that before then, well, this is before the passage of the 14th Amendment,
Mhm.
slaves weren't citizens, therefore reparations. Okay.
No,
So then-
then
it doesn't
I don't
matter
have a
then.
single argument that can be summed up except to say that there's not
It
a
seems like I have a
sufficiently.
bunch of really bad arguments, though.
Well, no,
What-
I'm putting out examples of why this issue is so complex and it doesn't fit neatly into U.S. government did something bad, therefore they need to pay now, right? I understand the reasoning, but when it
Mhm.
gets to the legal specifics and how it actually applies, taking that principle that in theory and actually putting it down and applying, it's not as cut and dry as you would make it sound.
No,
I do
I'm not,
know enough about
I'm
the
not,
law to understand that.
No,
And
I'm
what
not,
I'm showing is a bunch of different instances where the variables matter. They're not inconsequential when it comes to deciding what that payout is, what form it takes, how long it goes, and who is eligible. right? That's where I'm coming from. So when you say, is your argument statute of limitations? No, but the statute of limitations is not an insignificant detail. Is your argument
It
lack
is,
of citizenship? No, but if we're going to use the internment camp precedent as relevant, we need to understand the distinction there. And legally speaking, citizens and non-citizens are treated differently under the law. Right. So there's a lot of complexity here that I don't think you're taking into consideration. So I'm
I
willing
don't
to
think
grant it in principle, but I've yet to see you make the case that sufficiently justifies paying out from the U.S. government and state governments collectively to a body of people for a legitimate harm that was done hundreds of years ago.
So you said I had to make the case, but I've been asking for a hole in it, and you said you couldn't put one in it. That means that I made the case.
No, I'm
Also,
not saying
if we're talking about
can't
citizenship,
Okay.
it really doesn't matter. If you could be. I was in Germany working not too long ago. If a German fire truck were to hit my car, they owe me money. It doesn't matter that I'm not a German citizen. So let's throw the citizenship thing like out of it. Like the government did some stuff they weren't supposed to do. Like I just don't see why that matters.
No, that's not the case, right? Because we talked about with Frank, the government didn't do anything that they weren't supposed to do, right? They didn't violate the law in that case. And in the case of slavery, we're not saying
law. Slavery didn't violate the law.
That's what I'm saying. That's what
I'm saying. That's why it's 1 for 1. They didn't violate. The firefighter didn't violate the law. Government didn't violate the law.
Right. So if you want to make the justification for the government now paying descendants of those who were done some sort of wrong, there has to be an articulation of what that wrong does, how it applies to their descendants today. And that case has not been made. Your basic reasoning is fine. And that's what I said I can't poke a hole in. Your insistence of saying, okay, therefore, this is what we need to do works just fine until you start getting into the particulars.
But
you don't get into the particulars.
I didn't want to get into the particulars because we can't even agree on a macro level. Like, because like my whole goal was just to get you to agree that reparations ought to be paid. And now if you're saying that you don't agree because I haven't figured out the particulars, okay, cool. Do you agree in principle that reparations ought to be paid?
I said a while back. Let's say for the sake of argument, we're paying reparations for slavery. How does that work?
Well, not for the sake of argument. Like,
yeah,
I'm asking, like, in principle, are you going to say now that you do support reparations? Not necessarily. No. Okay, and why not?
Because I'm agnostic towards the question of reparations at this point. I have yet to see a sufficient case made to justify paying or compensating. We won't even say paying. Compensating people today for a wrong that was done at this point, 160 to, we'll say 160 to 240, 50 years.
Let's get really like broad for a second. Let me get really general.
I'd also like to point out,
generally speaking, what does it take for somebody to make their argument? From my point of view, like when I talk to people on the show, if somebody brings on an argument that I can't poke holes in, then I'll accept that.
Sure.
That's how that works. Like me and Fasad, we get into arguments all the time, right? And sometimes he made arguments I could poke holes in it, and sometimes I can't. And if I can't, I'd be like, okay, yes, you've made a solid argument. Boom. I am now convinced of that thing. That is how that works. All right. Now,
assuming you have all the relevant information. Yeah. 100%.
Well, no. So, like, I don't like. Obviously, I'm not omniscient. I won't know if I have all the relevant information. But from what
you don't have to be omniscient, though.
Yeah, but I don't have to know that I have all the relevant information. From the facts available to me right now, I would have to accept that if I hear the argument and there's no hole in it, that means from my epistemic point of view, I have a sound argument. That means you have to accept it. That's the way logic works.
I mean, if that were the case, sure, but you haven't made that case yet.
What?
I mean,
Okay, but
your
what
basic
is
principle
what is
is
the whole?
fine.
I don't. Okay, but what is the whole? But how can you? You're saying you agree with the basic principle, but you're
Mhm.
still against it in principle.
No. Well, okay. So I'm with the basic principle
Mm-hmm.
that if the government allows or commits something wrong, we'll just say
Mm-hmm.
morally wrong, because that's kind of what we're talking about here when in the case of slavery, or inflicts financial harm. That's probably a better way to say it. Inflicts financial harm, then there is liability on that government, on that entity, to make the person, no, the entity who lost the or had suffered the financial loss, to make them whole,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so what I would say is, in principle, there's a window of time where that would have made perfect sense. At this point, because of the complexities of the situations that we're talking about,
But it's not
do you do,
complex. But in
it
my
is
situation,
complex.
I can
It's
tell.
it's
But I can
immensely
tell.
complex, and
Okay, so
that's part of the problem, is you're denying aspects of it that come into play when it comes to the particulars. You're throwing them
in
out in principle and saying those don't
in
matter.
my in
Let's
my
talk about
case,
this.
let's talk about in my case. Like in my
Hmm.
case, what's the complex part?
What?
Like
Oh,
in
you're
my
talking about.
case, yeah, in my case, because the complexities you're just talking about, just like like the loss of traceability over time, which is not that long ago. But you're in my case, I can tell you who the slave owner was.
Okay. But I mean, when it comes to establishing specific harm that was done, so my question
Slavery.
to you would be, no, not slavery generally, but there
Mhm.
has to be some specific harm that's being compensated for, right?
Slavery. That's what's being harmed. Being That's a
Okay,
specific
so
thing.
so in your situation,
Mhm.
what compensation would be reasonable in your mind?
Okay, hang on. Before he answers that, let me ask a question. Do you agree with the idea that someone that has been harmed should be compensated?
Um, like, just in general,
And
somebody suffered harm,
on the
they deserve to be
whole, do you
compensated.
think, like in Frank's case, that he deserved that the Fairfax County government paid him some sort of way or some sort of monies to replace or do whatever he wants with the money, but
Yeah.
essentially because they destroyed his car? Do you
In
think that
Frank's
is
case, yes. The
okay?
way you
But
phrased it generally, no.
okay, but the reason I ask this is because to me, for the past couple minutes, maybe longer, it seems to me like what you're arguing is because there aren't enough like exact detail specifics to tie up all the loose ends of what reparations might look like,
Mhm.
you disagree with them.
It not in total, but that's part of it.
Okay, but
I will acknowledge that.
I and what I wanted to point out is that I don't think that's the argument that AAA is actually making.
Mhm.
If I'm mistaken, AAA, please jump in and correct me. But we're just talking about the principle and concept. I think everyone on this call and everyone in the chat that's been commenting is well aware of how complex of an issue this is, and financially how complicated things would have to get to make it even remotely close to what anyone might call someday fair, right? And
Mhm.
even then, it's still problematic because what I'm doing is I'm putting a price tag on people's ancestors' freedom and livelihood and education and etc. So even then, I don't know that any number of money or tax avoidance or etc. will actually uh, compensate for what has happened to the slaves and their descendants, right? I don't know that
Yeah.
any number could ever actually do that. But that doesn't mean that I disagree with the legal principles of if actions are performed, compensation follows. It seems to me like where you're stuck is what you're stuck on is that because we don't have all the details ironed out, and by the way, there are a lot of details to iron out. There are a lot of considerations that would have to be made. There are people that are undoubtedly descendants of slaves and descendants of slave owners that have no clue that that is their history. There are people that are undoubtedly going to get missed. There are people that may have, come at one day before slaves were made free, but they're able to trace it to that and receive the same amount of money as people that were generational slaves, right? And that may not seem fair. But you would agree that would you agree, in general, that compensating for such a civil issue, for instance, in this case, ownership of another person, is a just thing to do? Just like paying Frank for the destruction of his car would be a just thing to do. I'm not asking you to put a number on Frank's car because I didn't tell you what kind of car Frank drove. I'm not asking you to put a number on his medical bills because I didn't tell you how much his hospital cost. I'm not asking you to put a number on pain and suffering or the, et cetera, of his children. I'm just asking you, don't you think it would be fair, or don't you think it would follow the legal principles set to pay Frank something for the damage that was caused under the supervision and instruction of the U.S. government? They were following laws. They were doing everything legal. They drove a fire truck down the lane and it sideswiped his car. The people that owned slaves were doing legal things. Slave owning was legal, but it was under the tutelage and under the I guess, Democratic Republic of the U.S. at the time, however you want to call it. I guess we were a democratic republic officially as of 1776, but we owned slaves during, technically slaves have been in North America since 1619, but the U.S. wasn't officially formed until 1776. So from 1776 until 1865, when slavery was outlawed, we would say that slave owning was legal for the United States. So wouldn't you say that since the United States is still an entity that exists, and allowed for this to happen under its system, that it should be in some way responsible, just like the Fairfax County government would be somewhat responsible for letting the people that drove that fire truck who sideswiped his car to reimburse or compensate in some way? Again, I understand there are an infinite number of details to iron out, and I don't think AAA was ever trying to present you this 700-page document of here's what happens in every decision tree ever.
Right.
But just in general, reparations should probably happen. And I think that's where you're kind of stuck.
I mean, I go back to, it would have been the right thing to do, likely, way back when. But at this point, aside from the fact that I don't think it's possible, I don't think it's helpful to try to go back and right that wrong. I think it's a dark period in our history for sure. I'm not denying that at all. And I mean, to say that, I think it's been said over and over and over again my whole life in any sort of government context that you want to say. But as far as finding financial restitution to whatever degree, no, I don't think we're at a point where that would be quote unquote just.
I don't. So you said like you don't think it'd be helpful. Whether it's helpful is kind of irrelevant. Like for instance, like with the Frank in the fire truck. Let's say his children are wealthy; they don't even need the money, so it wouldn't even be helpful. Mm-hmm. That doesn't absolve the Fairfax County of the responsibility.
Sure.
So let's throw that out because it's totally irrelevant. But can you explain? Because what will you say was the primary objection you have?
Well, I mean,
how do you think it's unfair?
Well, I don't think it's unfair. I think it's unjust because, or rather, it's not justice to say individuals today are paid for slavery, right? It's apples and oranges to compare it to Frank for a number of reasons that we've already said. But when you have a situation where there is harm inflicted on someone or on one entity by another entity, mm-hmm. Justice would dictate some sort of reparation there, some sort of repairing restitution, right? We're at a situation now where we
You're saying because the victim's dead.
No, I'm not saying because the victim's dead.
Okay.
I'm saying because we don't have quote unquote true victims at this point.
So in this case with Frank, you wouldn't have a quote unquote true victim either because Frank died. But the Fairfax still pays.
Okay. And that's certainly fine to do. Just like I said before.
But why are you applying different rules?
It's not different rules. It's different application of the same principles. Right? Because for one thing, in Frank's case, we're talking something vastly different. So I mean it's reparations for slavery is infinitely more complex than getting sideswiped by a fire truck on the interstate or wherever. So there's all these distinctions that are material when it comes to adjudicating this in a judicial context.
But when you point out the distinctions, they don't seem to be relevant. Like you talked about the non-existence of true victims, or you talk about that it was what else did you say, that it wasn't helpful, like stuff like this. Like I don't see why it matters. I'm
not using those as linchpins of the argument. But fundamentally, we're talking about what liability falls on the U.S. government. At this point, if the U.S. government is going to issue some sort of reparation today, what liability can be shown? What, in the context of our existing judicial system, can be shown within that context? And as of right now, everything that we've seen shows that any sort of statute of limitations, for example, not the only case, but that would have expired long ago.
I thought we agreed that wouldn't apply. So you are saying the same thing that you said you weren't saying.
No, so for example,
that statute of limitations applies to acts of Congress. What we're talking about was the Constitution. It was slavery was allowed in the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Clause, that is the part of the Constitution. Dred Scott decision. Remember that when he was suing for his freedom, they were arguing about a clause in the Constitution. This was not a congressional act.
Okay, I asked this earlier because to help get on the same page to make this consistent. What part of the Constitution are you talking about? You said Article 1.
I said Article 1 by mistake. It is referenced in Article 1, but Fugitive Slave Clause. Look at that. That's actually in Article 4.
Okay. So, I was curious about that because I kind of pulled up Article 1 and was skimming it and wasn't able to see it. So I'm good with that.
Article 1, it talks about the slave trade, how it wouldn't be allowed, it couldn't be outlawed into January 1808, and Congress did that on January 1st.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about we're not talking about a congressional act. We're talking about the Constitution. That's why in order to free slaves, they had to amend the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm with you on that. I don't have any issue with that.
Okay, so statute of limitations. Let's not bring that up again.
But if we're talking about financial restitution or through the judicial process, right, through the judicial system, any sort of civil conflict like this comes with some sort of statute of limitations. So we can't throw that out and then say we want to treat it like any other case, right? You're the one that's applying for that's trying to get special pleading in this case. And I'm telling you, it's fine to do that because it's such a unique situation. But don't try to fit a square peg in a round hole here.
No, but you're the one that's invoking statute of limitations where it doesn't apply.
No, So there's a couple of things here. I'm not trying to say that particular statute of limitations applies to this particular situation. I'm talking about statute of limitations generally because we're talking about civil financial law, where I think your issue, part of your issue is, like me, there's a vast ignorance of what law applies, right? Because when we're talking about establishing liability, establishing, what responsibility the federal government has, what responsibility falls on the states, and what that looks like in a legal context for each of these cases, and how that would be adjudicated.
So
There's likely laws out there, precedents that would come into play. We don't know what those are. One of the key differences is I'm willing to withhold judgment until all of that comes out, or at least a sufficient amount. You're willing to just deny all of it and say you want
I'm
it
not
to
denying,
fit.
but I'm not denying I'm not denying any of it. Like I've been asking you for
Sure you are.
poke a hole in it. You can't poke a hole in it. And what you're saying is, I can't. Here's this argument that I can't refute, but I'm not going to accept it because there could be some obscure legal reasoning out there that I'm not aware of that are defeated. That's exactly what you're saying. Like,
no, I'm not talking about obscure legal reasoning. I have enough lawyers in my family and have been familiar enough with the legal system and how situations like this, specifically civil lawyers, and how this applies, to know that there are aspects of the law that are necessary to bring into this conversation that your argument neglects. That's what I'm talking about. So it's not. No. Hear me out. I'm not saying that.
You suspect that there could be some aspects that my argument's neglecting. You don't know that. You're just like you're.
No, I'm confident in that because you have not cited any case, for example, that shows how the government would be liable in this situation.
Well, I did cite a case. I talked about the tree growing in front of the stop sign. If you want a case that talks specifically about this, it's not going to exist.
A municipal stop sign is going to be the city or county government.
Yeah, but
it's not going to be the state of Virginia anyway, right? It's going to be.
It could. No, slavery was legal in Virginia. There are people who could go to the state of Virginia for reparations. It wouldn't be me because mine is from South Carolina.
And the failure of your argument is it's not nuanced enough to take into consideration these things, and that's why.
But what things? You're not pointing out any things. You're saying there could be some things, or there's some things out there, but you're not telling me what they are, and you're acknowledging that you don't know what they are.
Wiping them away and refusing to acknowledge.
What was the thing? You said statute of limitations, where we said don't apply.
Yeah, that was one. Establishing the level of liability at the federal and state level. You haven't been able to do that.
Well, what do you mean establish the level of liability?
Right. What liability does the federal government has? Just pointing to the Constitution isn't sufficient to answer that question.
So what do you mean? Are you asking what liability? Are you asking what they did wrong?
No, I'm asking for. No, if we're talking about restitution, right? Mm-hmm. You mentioned earlier, just for the sake of our argument, $1 million, right? So if your ancestor was owed $1 million, there is potentially a liability shared among the
but
ones
remember
that inflicted the harm.
Facade said. Remember what Facade said. I wasn't trying to give you like a bill of exactly like microeconomic explanation of how it works.
Sure.
I was just talking about in principle.
Right. And so the $1 million isn't a specific number, but it's helpful to illustrate. So in a situation like that, right? Mm-hmm. If it were determined that your ancestor was owed that $1 million, civil law, that liability can be shared, right?
Sure.
A portion of that $1 million is owed from the slaveholder, or maybe the slaveholder's estate, right? A portion of that is owed from the state of South Carolina. A portion of that falls on the federal government, right? There may be other players involved in this.
So that's an argument against using $1 million, not an argument against reparations.
No, because $1 million can help show that a distinction is there. We don't know what that distinction is. I'm not focusing on the $1 million. It can be $5 million, right?
No, so that's not. And I just threw that out. Remember what I had said twice, and I was just saying like taxes, right? Just pay no income tax. That's what I was saying. But what I wanted to stick to.
But how is that justice?
How is it justice?
Yeah, that's another aspect of a particular. So now we've left the area of theory and we're going into particulars. Mm-hmm. It doesn't establish justice, for example. Let me finish for a second. Right. It doesn't establish justice to say somebody who under our current system is paying no income tax federally because they fall in that with 40, somewhere 45 to 50%. That already doesn't pay income tax to come back and say, hey, congratulations, you got reparations, no more federal income tax. Right? That's not justice. There's no change there.
So for them, it could be different. For me, it could be no federal income tax. For somebody else, it could could work different. Like it wouldn't be a one size fits all type of deal. That's like
if you're talking about the same remedy given across the board, that's exactly what it is.
I'm saying the answer, like, so when we talk about like how this would work out in a form of public policy, that will be complex. But what we're talking about, because right now it seems like you agree in principle for reparations, and I'm trying to figure out what would it take to convince you, because I gave an argument, despite you not being able to refute it. You're saying you're not going to accept.
You gave a reasonable principle that doesn't fit within the context of judicial law,
and so
right? Because we don't have an explanation.
Don't apply.
I'm not talking about exceptions. I'm talking about clarifications, right? So what liability would be assumed by the federal government,
Slavery.
Right? No. That's not what I'm talking about.
You're asking how much they have to pay?
Not how much, right?
Oh,
like a proportion of it, right? Because if liability is shared among multiple parties, right?
That's the thing. But that's the thing I had just pointing out. So you're not agreeing. You're not disagreeing with the principle. You're just disagreeing with the method. And so we can talk about the method. This isn't a
disagreement in principle. This is a recognition of the failure of the argument because it's not taking into account proper nuance.
No,
because you're saying U.S. government did slavery bad, therefore U.S. government should.
It's not a failure. So my argument.
That's effectively it.
It's a misunderstanding. It's a failure of your understanding of the argument.
Okay,
because
so
I'm not
arguing
for any method. I'm arguing it ought to be paid because you asked me how the liability should work, and remember I threw out $1 million. I said no income tax. Like, I'm not arguing for any specific method. My argument specifically is just for the general principle. And you're saying you reject the argument because of reasons that you may be ignorant of, and also the method that I'm not.
Because I just said that. I just said your perspective is U.S. government permitted slavery bad. U.S. government owes reparations.
Yeah,
and you said no. So where have I mischaracterized your argument?
You right then you were talking about the method. You were saying
no, that's not method. U.S. government slavery bad. U.S. government owes reparations. Yes. Is that an accurate characterization of your argument?
Yes, but that is not what your critique was. 30 seconds ago, you were critiquing the lack of a method, and you were saying because I don't have a method, that's a problem with my argument. That is not what my argument was.
That's not what I'm saying. And see, this is
said that.
No, this is part of the failure of your argument, right? So, so for one, I want to say for the record, I'm not mischaracterizing your argument. Like, part of my argument, my main argument against yours is that it's too simple, if nothing else, right? It doesn't take into account proper nuance to be applied, right?
The nuance
as far as it goes,
and the method,
not necessarily, right? Because if you're talking about the principle of being able to pay reparations, there has to be some context, some contextual understanding of what liability is shared among what parties, right?
It would only be Frank's case. It would only be shared in this instance when I threw out a figure. I said $1 million. That would be shared among people. In the instance with a lack of income, when I say the lack of taxes, that wouldn't be shared. I wouldn't share my non-existent taxes with another black person. That doesn't even make any sense.
No, but for example, right? Taking the $1 million out of it, right? If there's a 33% share for that, right? Then you fill in one person, adjudicate it through that framework, right? And it's more complex than that, but you've got that framework. Then you have a particular number for a particular individual based on that framework. And then you go, all right, well, the U.S. government covers 1/3 of it. The individual slave or the state government where this took place covers the other another third. And then the estate or, the current wealth of the family of the third of the slaveholder specifically in situations carries the other burden. Now,
So the method is wrong.
it's not the method.
That doesn't disagree with the principle, because it'd be like
No,
for instance,
because
like
when you-
taxes. 2S tax law is very complex. People
Right.
pay different figures. People who even make the same amount, because the circumstances vary, pay different amounts in taxes.
Sure.
But saying the taxes is complex and saying that I don't have a way to fix the tax system isn't an argument against taxation. That isn't to mean that taxation as a principle is immoral or shouldn't be done. You're arguing against methods.
No.
And I'm not arguing for a method. I'm not saying what the tax rate ought to be. I'm not saying what the what amount should be paid to black people or any specific way. All I'm just saying, in principle.
Okay, so in principle, entity commits harm on somebody else, that entity suffers financial loss, then the entity that caused the harm pays it back. In principle, I've never argued against that. The problem is where our disconnect is applying that principle to now. So filling in some of those gaps and saying, all right, U.S. government, entity one inflicted harm, slaves, and then trying to figure out what that reparation is before we get to methods of payment. There's a method of adjudicating the responsibility there.
So
anyway.
You're saying since the law is complex, you're disagreeing.
I'm not saying because the law is complex, but I'm saying that the situation is complex and your simplistic explanation of it fails to take in adequately the depth of the situation, such that I can agree in principle that now the U.S. government should pay reparations to those who are descendants of former slaves.
Okay, let me ask a question. We're going to try going about it a different way, because it seems that we're still stuck on the same thing we were stuck on 16 minutes ago now.
Sounds about right.
So the question is, do you think that the Fairfax County government owes Frank any money for sideswiping his car? If so, why?
I don't, because I don't have enough information.
Okay, let's give you the information. Frank was driving legally in his lane. Fairfax County government has a fire truck that's in the emergency breakdown lane. They sideswipe the passenger side of Frank's car, which causes it to be totaled. Now, the fire truck was doing legal things, trying to get to a emergency or whatever. They weren't excessively speeding. They were driving cautiously, but they still swiped his car because fire trucks are big. They probably didn't see how big the fire truck was. Frank also doing everything legal and maintaining the distance and space in his lane, not in the lane of the breakdown, not in the way.
Right. So Frank wasn't over the line into the emergency lane, anything like that.
Right. We're just going to assume everybody's following the law. Okay. For the sake of
if that's
this
the case, then there's not anything that's necessarily owed to Frank.
But Frank's car is smashed up by a fire truck.
Sometimes things happen. And if Fairfax County, but because if you're talking about owing somebody money, right, then we're talking about doing harm to somebody else. If it's a victim of circumstance, I don't know what the particular legal terminology would be for it, then there's not any harm that was inflicted on Frank. Therefore, there's not any necessary liability to make Frank
totaled
whole.
his car.
They totaled
That's
his car.
No. But that can happen, right? So I mean, it's not.
But you said there was no harm inflicted.
No harm inflicted. There wasn't intentionality inflicted there. It was harm that occurred.
If it was intentional, it would have been a crime.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Yes,
so if you intentionally ran into somebody's car, you've committed a crime.
Yeah.
Well, so this is part of the issue when you're talking about legal distinctions. Is if there's no illegal activity taking place, then there's no necessary legal responsibility to repay somebody else for harm that they encountered, because you're not legally liable.
Sure, it's called civil suits. That's literally the whole other side of law outside of criminal.
Yeah, well, I mean, there can be
It's called
civil
civil
suits there,
liability.
and during that adjudication, if a judge determines it, then sure. But you're asking me, absent a judicial decision, which a judicial
No, I mean,
representative would
irrelevant
be
of a
representative of
ir-
Fairfax County, right? So
irrelevant
that
of a
would be
judicial
effectively saying
decision.
Fairfax County
Let's
has
throw
deemed the fire truck
Wes,
or the fire department
let's
liable.
just for a
So
second.
Fairfax County is going to reply. That's a necessary
Wes,
bit
just
of
for a
information
second.
that we have here.
Eradicate everything you know and think about the law as it is. I'm asking,
boy.
do you think it's just that Frank be paid if somebody smashes into the side of his car?
Well, that's a completely different situation than the specifics in his.
In the situation, a fire truck smashed into the side of his car.
That's part of the problem. Like when it comes to legal jurisprudence, there's a lot of these types of nuances that come to play. You can ignore them all you want to, but then don't come and say that you want this to be in the context of what would normally take place.
I don't care about the legal context. I'm asking you if somebody smashes up your car, do they not owe you for fixing your car?
Not
yes
necessarily.
Or no?
If they didn't do anything illegal.
Okay.
Right? If the statement
I am completely legal. I'm completely legal and driving my car on the road, okay? Mm-hmm. I'm completely legal and not applying the brakes at any point in time I want to. You pull out in front of me with your car. Now, you're fully out in front of me and you're going, okay? I'm now riding behind you. But I don't apply the brake and you're not going as fast as I am. And I run into the back of you. Do you think
you've done something illegal?
No, I mean, legally, sure. Now I've committed a crime.
Well, and that's a distinction that's made in the judicial process.
But what I'm saying is that there's whole other side of law. There's criminal law and then there's civil law, right? So let's just say I run into the back of you. But hold up. We're not asking should I get a ticket for running into the back of you. We're asking should I be responsible for paying for your car and or medical bills? Because those are two different things. So what I'm asking is when I don't slow down and I run into the back of your car, I'm not asking whether I should get a ticket or not. That's irrelevant. I don't care. Mm-hmm. I'm asking, should I be liable for repairing your car and or the medical damages I do to you?
See, and you're right that they're distinct.
Yeah,
but they aren't unrelated.
One is civil, one is criminal. Regardless of what the law is.
It's not criminal.
Regardless of what the criminal law is, there is a civil case that you now have.
Right.
Because you and I are both civilians.
No, the distinction.
I like to point out, I'm trying to figure out what changed Wes' mind because he agreed to this at the beginning of the show. It was like easy, like you acknowledged, yeah, I agree with that. Fire truck hit his car. I'm not.
Now I'm okay with paying him.
Law's
I'm not opposed necessarily for Fairfax County to reimburse Frank for the damages of his car.
Okay, but 30 seconds ago you were saying that he's not owed any money.
But there's a difference.
It was intentional.
There's a difference and a necessary distinction between Fairfax County deciding through an agent of Fairfax County we're going to pay Frank, and as opposed to me saying absent that decision, Fairfax County owes Frank. That's imposing a legal liability that has not been adjudicated, that has not been decided upon. Okay, right, and that's an example of the legal nuance
in
that
civil
AAA,
law,
your argument fails to take into consideration, and that's why I'm saying I withhold a belief. I'm agnostic on the question of reparations because your argument is insufficient.
So what? So you're saying so when the fire truck hit his car, mm-hmm. Frank isn't owed any money because there hasn't been a court case yet.
Because according to all of the facts that I have, there is no legal liability established for Fairfax County or for the fire department.
You said because there hasn't been a court case yet. So okay,
that's an instrumental, but I'm talking about a formal.
But that specifically that's what you were pointing to. Like
that's another necessary distinction, right? I'm not saying because there hasn't been a court case. Man, I'm saying principally speaking, there's no liability because there's nothing that's been put out. If it's a court case, sure. If it's an insurance claim, right? He could have insurance and not even fool with the court at all because he doesn't want to deal with court costs.
Yeah, that doesn't, and that doesn't.
He still gets restitution, but it's not necessarily coming from Fairfax County. There's variables here that come to play.
Fairfax County can have insurance, but
they can.
Yeah,
and the restitution can come from their insurance company, not from Fairfax County. Right, so I mean that's another layer of this.
I don't know why this is complex now, because this was so simple at the beginning of the show.
Everything with the law is complex, and that's what I'm saying is the problem with your argument is it doesn't take into account the complexities of making the decision before we even get to method of payout.
But like the parts you're pointing to, like seems to, I'm just trying to figure out where the problem is. Because at first it sounded like maybe like a few seconds ago you were saying because the court case hasn't happened yet. And then when I talk about that, you were like, oh, well, it's actually something different. Perhaps they have insurance. And then we're going, like, it's getting crazy. Like at the beginning of the show, it was so easy.
It was. It was so easy because the question was different.
But then you had all these, no, it was the exact same scenario. But then you threw all these arguments and they were just failing one after one after one after one. And it gets to the point where you got nothing left but to just, when we give you a simple analogy, to just break it up into confusion. What if insurance? What about the law? What about this other thing that I never heard of? Like, come on, man. Do you genuinely think? Are you sure you've been honest right now?
I'm being 100% honest. But I think one of the things that I've seen and I've experienced in this very episode is you say an argument fails when really you've dismissed the idea of it.
So
that's part of the issue.
Be specific. Be specific about that, because like
statute of limitations, right? That's an example. You want to say no statute of limitations applies, so we're not even going to consider the importance of statute of limitations when it comes to adjudicating whether or not the United States government should pay reparations.
So be specific.
Can I handle
you
that
said
one?
The statute of limitations. I point out the statute of limitations for congressional acts were 4 years. You mistook the Constitution for an act of Congress.
No.
I clarified that. No.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, go back. No.
Can we get away from Article 1 is not an act of Congress,
No. I'm pointing this out. But this is what you were saying. And then I pointed this out.
It never was. Everybody watching, rewind it and go watch it for yourself. Right? I never said Article 1 is an act of Congress. I was taking an example from what Facade brought up.
Let me jump in here. The point you were trying to make is that because this article that I pointed out in Title 28 Code of the U.S. is regarding federal civil suits, is limited to 4 years on acts of Congress, which slavery was not. Okay, so since slavery was not an act of Congress,
right?
Section Code 20, Title Code 28 of the U.S. Federal Code does not apply.
Agreed.
And given there are no current precedents on the reparations of slaves and their descendants on the books in the U.S., otherwise we'd have people pointing to them. There is no current precedence for a statute of limitation for formerly U.S.-owned slaves. Therefore, applying Title Code 28 to slavery is an incorrect application of statute of limitations. Currently, we don't have one. There is no current statute of limitations for reparations of slaves in the United States. Therefore,
I would also agree.
To make the argument that it's past statute of limitations or that it might be beyond that is null, because there isn't a current statute of limitations in law for reparations on slaves.
I don't know that I'd go that far, but I see where you're going. My point in using that time window, that statute of limitations, was in part to show that the neglect of Congress to properly protect slaves in this country could potentially constitute an act of Congress, just to get some sort of
So you were saying that.
No. It was
But
it was
also,
illustrative.
it wasn't.
I wasn't leaning on that as the argument itself. I was just trying to bring some specifics in as a comparison, sort of like your $1 million, right? The $1 million, take it or leave it, but it's helpful to illustrate more necessary aspects of the case. And so,
But to be clear, I
it could be
didn't
4 years, it could be non-existent.
to be
Okay,
clear,
but to say that it doesn't exist as a whole, when none of us have an adequate knowledge of the law, probably is a step too far. And it's
Okay,
why I'm not willing
Wes,
to immediately jump over to your. But I want to say the
that's
idea that I'm
fine.
not willing to immediately jump over and agree with you.
That's
is
fine.
doing-
Let's grant you that you're absolutely right, and there are undoubtedly very specific exceptions to the statute of limitations. Why not bring them up in objections to the case of reparations while agreeing with the idea and concept of reparations? Because that's the whole point of the argument, and that's the whole point of the discussion, is that there may be some nuanced law that no one on this earth is aware about until they go and research ancient, historic U.S. law, right? No one currently living is aware that the law that is going to object to this and break the case is alive today, right? That could be a thing. You're absolutely right. It is possible. However, the whole point of the argument is to discuss that reparations, at least as far as how the government currently treats things that they screw up when they cause harm to people, is currently handled by providing them some sort of financial retribution. For instance, when Frank's car got smashed by a government vehicle, the government gave Frank money. Does it bring Frank's car back? No. Will it bring Frank's life back if Frank died? No. Will this fix all of the problems that slavery caused? Absolutely not. But that's not the argument AAA was presenting, and he's not giving you a 900-page code of how to handle each situation individually. He's giving you a concept of government screwed up, government pays.
Mm-hmm.
We agreed that when the government screwed up in current law, the government pays for Frank. There would be no reason other than some objection you could potentially come up with by some unknown law that no one knows, including yourself, to object to that. Because you're not aware of anything, potentially some statute of limitations that doesn't exist, potentially some act of Congress that wasn't an act of Congress, potentially this, that, or the other that wasn't those things either. We're talking about the U.S. government allowed for slavery in the U.S. Constitution. By doing so, now owe people money for being slaves. Just like Frank is owed money for his truck being smashed. And if Frank dies, it goes to his next of kin. That's simple.
I like to give I like to give Wes last word. My wife sent me a pair of eyeballs.
No,
So that means like
That
what
means
do
get
you
the
need to
heck
get
off.
off the show.
Yeah,
But
I know that. I know that look.
I would like to say that, Fasad, I know you don't tend to contribute as much, but man, when you get worked up, I love it.
I really.
It's so much fun.
I hear that. I know on the podcast, at least on the people that watch live, and if you go and listen to us live or listen to us after the fact, we all sound about the same. I intentionally made it that way, right? When we talk. However, when I talk loud, I get really loud on the show. But it's not loud to you guys. You'll notice there are times where I try to interject to Google Meet, which is what we use for the platform, and which you guys just don't hear me well. So I apologize to the people listening because I'm incredibly loud to them when I have to speak up. But at the same time, if I want to interject something to you guys, I have to overtalk typically AAA to get a word in. And so I have to, hey, I want to say something here, and that's really loud on YouTube, but it's not very loud for you guys, right? I'm not screaming in your ear, at least from what I can tell listening to the other side. So that's a little clarification of that. Yeah, last word of the show. We'll call it quits for now. Thanks for coming back on. It was fun.
yeah, man, appreciate it, bro.
I love it. I would like to say that to be constructive, what I was trying to do was not necessarily make an alternate case, but rather help bring your case along. So with what I'm pointing out or what I'm identifying as lack of consideration for the complexities in the decision making. I'd like to see that fleshed out to see how you would how would you proportion liability, for example, and some particulars, maybe not into exact payouts, but I would like to see that. But it was a fun conversation, guys. As always, I really enjoyed it. And AAA, tell your wife I'm sorry to catch you so long.
Yes, sir. I'll blame you. That'll get me off the hook. All right, guys. I appreciate you coming on, man.
We'll see you guys next week. We're talking about Ezekiel
Ezekiel.
26 next week.
Yeah.
So
Ooh,
that'll be
fun.
fun.